Good afternoon. Someone VP? I hope not. So, good afternoon, students from Taiwan as well. Is everyone already there? May we start? Okay. 多分担当者はまだ来てないですね。もう聞こえる。Can you hear me? Please raise your hand. Okay, here we go. Then the third part, final one, on food function. One more very basic question. Is there someone here who I have not yet called the name? I think I didn't call you. So can you try to answer this question?
Nutrition and nutrients.
What is the difference? Yeah, if you may.
Nutrition. Nutrients. Nutrients give you nutrition.
Sorry?
So nutrients are the actual things that will give you nutrition.
Yeah, nutrients are basically the compounds or those macronutrients or the micro that we just discussed this morning. Could be protein, lipids, carbohydrates, and so forth. And then nutrition itself, where I will start from, is the process of whether when we have certain meal, we'll be eating, digesting them, what will be absorbed by our body and what will not. And then it will be transported to those organs that we are targeting them to be delivered to, whether it is in our stomach or intestine, where they will be absorbed and so. And then they will finally be utilized. If we eat certain carbohydrates, bread and rice as a source of energy, then that energy will be utilized for our exercises, for example. So basically, the idea is, or the difference among them, those nutrients, which I will talk a little bit more later on, are the macronutrients or micronutrients that we talked about this morning. And nutrition itself is the whole process by which food is taken and utilized by our body. So the science of nutrition studies the interaction between individual and environment mediated by the food. And while doing so, in this science, we may have all of these different areas of study that may be considered, whether we would have someone studying or doing some of the research on relating to food production, and some other people could be looking into this diet composition with which nutrients we have there, nutritive or even non-nutritive substances. Could be different areas involved in food intake and the diet. When I talked about this morning, the secondary function or the taste function, whenever we have a certain meal because we want to have pleasure of eating that meal, together with that will come the so-called appetite, how much we are really willing to have that certain meal or that certain sweet or hot spicy food that we would like to eat. So always this is one of the areas of study when we talk about nutrition, could be one among them. Digestion and absorption of the nutrients. I was talking about those For instance, carotene, beta carotene, which is in carrots, or lycopene in tomato. We may eat the fresh product as it is, but maybe only a small part of it may be absorbed by our body during the digestion. So some of the people doing or studying or doing research in this area, they are looking into specifically this sort of information during the digestion, how much of those nutrients will be absorbed by our body. Sometimes, or most of the times, those studies, such as in our laboratory, we also do so, are done in a way so-called in vitro studies, meaning just do them in the laboratory using a test tube and so. They could be animal studies done with rats and so forth, and maybe in a much minor frequency or smaller frequency, I may say, some of these studies may be done with humans. Initially, the in vitro, so-called in vitro, just done in the laboratory studies are that maybe the ones which have most of publications regarding this absorption of nutrients during digestion. Other area of studies involving nutrition could be metabolism of those certain nutrients that we are considering, and biological actions as well of some so-called essential nutrients. I will go back later on. I will talk a little bit more about those which could be the essential nutrients. Nutrients requirements in individuals, but we may have different regions or different environmental conditions, populations, so we may have to provide different nutrients for those living, for instance, in the top of the mountain or just living on the sea. They may have completely different conditions of temperature and so on and so forth. Some may need more source of energy, some may not, for example. Health effects of nutrients deficiency and excesses of nutrients. When I talked about the supplementation or development of those the so-called functional foods, nowadays there are many supplements, food supplements, a source of minerals and vitamins and so. But at the same time, consumers have to be careful about sometimes the function claimed by the manufacturer, that certain product is not really as effective as it is claimed for, and people just meaning we have also to avoid the excesses of consuming those nutrients, just purchasing supplements and consuming them by ourselves without information and without advice of professionals from the area may also be not good. Long-term effects of diet constituents, which of those, for example, the minor or micronutrients that I mentioned a while ago, if we keep taking those supplements during all over the year for a long time, which effects those may have, and whether therapeutic or preventive effects of certain foods that we are having. So when we talk about this science of nutrition, different areas of study may be considered, and there are lots of research going on in those different areas nowadays. Sorry. So food, nutrition, and the body. If we think if I may say, thinking from our body point of view, from the external part of the environment, which will be the food that we take, and as an agent delivering those certain nutrients that we consume during the diet, the meals that we have in our body will be the host. How much of those nutrients have really the function that we were aiming for, the purpose that they were eaten for, whether they are to provide energy or to regulate our body or to help building our body and so on and so forth. So here are some more details about that will be generally considered when we think of whether it's from the larger or the external point of view from the food itself. And many people may be looking into the different food production systems as well as how to distribute them, whether it has to be, for example, in a cold chain or just in trucks at room temperature and so on and so forth. At the same time, hygiene all over this distribution chain and during processing as well, while preparing the foods that we'll be having, labeling those food products, and preparing the meals themselves. So whether we may have throughout this chain here may have a very good control of, say, temperature and hygiene, and it was packed in a very hygienic material, hygienic way, but then when it goes to certain restaurant, the way they handle it further is not inappropriate, then this may take out all the care that was taken previously in the chain. So all these have to be looked into very carefully. Same way as I probably will say the compounds themselves, the nutrients that we were having, whether those are carbohydrates, proteins, so on and so forth, the ones we talked about this morning, the macro or the micronutrients. And why we take those for regulating our body could be some physiological effects that we were, I mentioned a while ago when I talked about the functional foods. For instance, generally they will have an additional function, which could, in many cases, they have some effect in our body promoting our health. And it could be as well related to the lifestyles and the needs, different needs from consumers. I mentioned, for example, from different regions, people from different regions may have more need of energy or some other nutrients in their diet that have to be considered. So, as opposing to nutrition, the concept or definition of nutrition that I mentioned a while ago, the nutrients will be the chemical substances themselves present in food, and those are the ones responsible for nourishing our body, whether those are the carbohydrates or proteins that we discussed a little bit during this morning. So whichever meal that one may have, there will always be some of these nutrients present in there. And in the very beginning of that part about food function and why do we eat certain food, we would always rather have certain meal containing food materials from those different three different categories or classes that we mentioned there, those, whether it is for providing energy, for regulating our body, or to help building our body. And for those, we will be having whether it is the so-called macronutrients, the three major nutrients that we saw this morning: carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and the proteins. And there could also be the so-called micro, those present in very tiny or small quantities, the micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and water as well. So both of them, macronutrients and micronutrients, are equally important, and they are all essential for maintaining good health in our body. And each nutrient plays this significant role so that we can maintain our body healthy, and whether those for regulating, for example, which I mentioned, whether it is to regulate the sugar level in our blood or blood pressure and so forth. Those three examples that I gave, those are only a few examples of how these, especially micronutrients, they're generally present in very small quantities. but they have a very major role in keeping our body healthy. I'm very sorry for the tiny or small letters in there, just for you to have a basic idea about when I explain about the macronutrients that we have there, whether it is carbohydrate, protein, or lipids, as well as water, and as if we have a certain food material as source of energy, for instance, for example, when we eat rice, white rice, or ground beef, how many calories we may have in there. So one of those functions that we saw there were the ones supposed to provide energy in our meal. And we may see that here that those that can provide more of energy if we were to have potatoes and so on and so forth. Or we might want to have some more salad or fruits, and then have some of those, even if they're present in lower concentration, smaller amounts, but to complete or to balance our diet also. So we will rather generally have good distribution among each of these major or macronutrients in there, as well as thinking about how much energy we can have from certain meal and calories we may have. And when I explained a little bit about development of these functional foods, I talked about the solubility. So whether certain compounds are, whether they dissolve in oil or whether they dissolve in water, is a very major information for the food manufacturers when they want to produce a certain food, to manufacture a certain food product. They would rather consider if some of those vitamins are present in there, how will it be in the final product, how available, how much of those will be suitable for being absorbed by our body in the final product. So the solubility, whether those are soluble in water or in oil, will have to be considered also. So in case of fat soluble vitamins, we may have those different classes of vitamin A, D, E, and K, and specific functions for each one of them, and where we can obtain them from in the nature, those fresh products. But then again, repeating, having, for instance, vitamin E from vitamin A from eggs or fish liver and so, not necessarily means that only having that present in our meal, it will be absorbed in our body. Again, just repeating those, especially those fat-soluble compounds, they have to be dealt with very much care. If they were to be consumed just as they are, same aside from vitamins, could be, for example, carotenoids, and so those which only dissolve in oil, only tiny or small amounts of those will be absorbed by our body as the way they are present in nature, as opposed to those which are water soluble. So from the beginning, such as vitamin C, they may be more available to be absorbed by our body. But then, because they can be very easily dissolved in water, and generally they will be present in many cases in a liquid form, then there is an disadvantage that just by being dissolved already, they start decomposing. They're not very much stable. You may remember, some of you might remember the one figure, very small figure that I showed here this morning, so-called multiple emulsions, where there was some white small dots inside those were water droplets. inside an oil droplet, and then again that oil droplet dispersed in water. Why do we go all the way doing such a complicated processing? Because so that we can increase the stability of these compounds. For instance, vitamin C, it may be decomposed very easily once it is dissolved, once it is in the liquid form, just by being here because of the light action, may already start decomposing it, or if there is oxygen in the system, already will start being oxidized also. So they may also decompose very easily. We have to deal with them very carefully. Anyhow, they are water soluble. For those food manufacturers, it might be easier to deal with them from the point of view how will they incorporate them in certain food product, whether it is a liquid product or so. And the functions, what they are mostly well known for instance, in case of vitamin C, what are the antioxidant activity as well, and generally obtained from citrus fruits and other sources of fruits and vegetables. We can find them. I mentioned about those essential nutrients a while ago. Those are some substances or the nutrients that can be found in food, and they're very much, as the name says, they're very much important or necessary or essential for maintaining our body healthy, necessary for life, growth, and tissue repair. And they cannot be produced by our body. So we need them, we need to supply them from our diet, whichever fruits or vegetables and so that we are to eat, containing those essential nutrients, we will obtain from there. We cannot synthesize them, we cannot produce them in our body. And then when we are talking about this nutrition field, nutrition science, if we were to provide a certain food product containing certain nutrients, we have to be aware how much, first of all, how much of these certain nutrients we are supposed to consume every day, and how much are we supposed, if we are going to intentionally add those nutrients to certain food material, up to how much can we put in that certain food material, the limit for this addition. So for those, there are different definitions, and among them there is so-called requirement. How much of this certain nutrient are we required to have, let's say, per day or so? The minimum amount of certain nutrient needed to sustain physiological state, function, or structure in an individual. So there are different ways of defining or stating this minimum requirement, which I will show in the next slides, how we call these. There are different ways of defining them as well. But basically, the requirement itself means the minimum concentration or quantity of this certain compound that we are considering, aiming to have this physiological function, or how it will act in the structure in our body. And it may be defined different ways, so-called dietary reference index. Many cases we may find in literature and handbooks as well, just the abbreviation BRI, and dietary reference index. And one way of defining them, excuse me. One way of defining is so-called estimated average requirement, and maybe the most common or most well-known so-called recommended dietary allowance, RDA, and in a certain day, how much per day, per kilogram of body, how much are we supposed to have of this certain compound, or adequate intake, and another definition is the tolerable upper intake level UL. Anyway, some of them, how can they be calculated? It is stated or shown here in this graph, the increasing intake of the certain compound or nutrient that we are considering, and the frequency distribution for individual requirements. So, for instance, if we were to supply certain carbohydrates or source of sugars, and how much of the glucose will come in our bloodstream may be measured, and then we may have the response that we are looking for there. So the EAR, the first one in their estimated average requirement, basically the average in this frequency distribution, the average point, and then if we were to add two standard deviations, we will have the recommended dietary allowance. So rather than considering only the average value, there will be some deviation from it, actually twice the standard deviation. So these are the limits supposed or considered as the recommended. So every individual having a certain body weight it's recommended to have this certain amount of whether it is vitamin C or whichever nutrient or compound we are considering, for example, per day. Those will be the allowance or the recommended allowance. And in order to define those doses, some scientific bases are needed for establishing those limits or those certain values. For instance, all these factors have to be considered, observed in healthy populations, and epidemiological observations as well, balanced studies. So in all those cases, could be studies done with humans, as I mentioned. In some cases, could be studied with, could be some animal studies, but still they have to be performed. Studies of repletion or depletion of a certain nutrient during the digestion or after a certain time of being consumed. And well, animal experiments, biochemical measurements. So some of those may be done in vitro, in the laboratory, using test tubes or so, especially those relating to digestion. If we want to simulate gastric digestion as it was supposed to take place in our body, gastric digestion in the stomach or in the intestine, gastrointestinal digestion tests can be done in vitro in the laboratory, but some also have to be done using animals, and so that we can try to extrapolate or to extend those results to humans. And also we would have to be aware or consider so-called food additives. I mentioned about those functional foods, which will generally have one additional function aside from the one that we were aiming for, whether it is to be eaten as a source of energy or because we want to have support building our body or because we like those. But we might want to have some additional function also. And when we are to add these so-called bioactive compounds, whether those are antioxidant compounds and so, in which way are we allowed or are we supposed to add those compounds? Sometimes they may be seen or may be classified as additives, the food additives. And they can be added different ways, direct additives, so-called direct additives added to foods for a specific reason, or indirect ones. which are intentionally, they unintentionally become part of the food. I will explain details later. But so basically, it has been there, put in there intentionally because we want to have that certain function that was not there from the beginning of this meal that we are going to have, or in other cases, such as this indirect, I will explain later on, but just for you to have an idea, it would be pesticides that we were used in the field before harvesting the grass, and so that the cows would eat that grass, and then the pesticide passed to the meat, and we ate that meat. So those will be indirect additives. Unintentionally, they're present there in a certain food, and they also have to be dealt with, considered. So as for definition first, what is food additive? This is one definition by one, was defined already in 1938 in US by the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. So the term food additive means any substance which intended, or the results coming from the use of that certain substance may reasonably be expected to directly, whether it is directly or indirectly, becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristic of any food. So those, I understand this may not be very easy to understand the definition, but consider it was in the many decades ago, the sentence itself, how it was defined. Anyhow, including any substances intended for use during the production, manufacturing, the processing of that certain food, preparing, treating, during the packaging itself, before shipping to the market, transporting, or holding food. So any of those substances that have been present there, whether they were intentionally added, meaning directly, or unintentionally they're present there, indirectly present, they may be considered, may have to be considered as additive, unless that certain compound has been already registered or recognized as so-called generally recognized as safe. Any substance which already has this classification, the so-called GRAS, or generally recognized as safe, whether it is extracted, natural, meaning extracted from plant leaves and so, or whether it has been synthesized in the laboratory, but it has been recognized as safe, then those substances, they're not food additives. They may be considered as food. Whichever substance that has not yet been recognized, or which is not generally recognized as safe, and there will be, for instance, intentionally added to the food, or they become, or they happen to be present there because earlier in the process they were added at some point, then those will have to be dealt with as if they are food additives. So additives, they may be added intentionally, and then for different purposes. For instance, for maintaining the consistency of that certain product that we have, to improve or maintain nutritional value, to keep food appetizing, so that when we look at this, that maybe probably the color did not change, or there is no flavors and so on and so forth, so people will still want to eat it, and wholesome, there's no parting or liquid leaking out from there, and so on and so forth, and provide labeling so that, for instance, in case of bread, we would want this during the process. we will want this to grow as much as possible, and then there will be some bubbles in there, and this will be more, it will be soft, and that's the texture that we like, as well as could be for enhancing flavor, color of the products, such as in case of ham. So we may have some additives intentionally put in there so that we'll have the color that we are aiming for. These are some of the, or basically the purposes whenever we are to have certain additive in the food during preparing a certain food product. They may have one or different reasons for being added there intentionally. These are the ones added there directly or intentionally. And then the indirect ones, they may be considered also as food contact substance. Again, another definition, which was given by that same, a different act, but still the same Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. And the definition is any substance intended for use as a component of materials used in manufacturing, packaging, transporting, or holding food. If such use is not intended to have any chemical or technical effect in the food. So materials that may be in direct contact or substance that may be in direct contact with the food material. Most cases, those will be, for example, films used when we have a certain product which is in a tray, could be steak or fish, and then there's a layer of film covering that tray, the plastic using there. If it is in direct contact with the food material that we have there, it will have to be considered as food contact substance. And it is not supposed or not intended to change anyhow technical or the properties of the food itself, might be for the intention of keeping its own characteristics as it was immediately after prepare. Some of these unintentional food additives could be insecticides, as I mentioned, that could be spread there in the field, while some of them maybe the feed, which was used to feed those animals, and so insecticides, fungicides, herbicides could be transferred to the meat of cows, for instance, and when we eat the meat, we may be indirectly absorbing those, even though it's very little or small quantities, but still they may have an intention or undesired effects. Plant growth regulators, again, if certain plants were used as feed for the animals and these regulators have been used in their growth for enhancing their growth, for instance, and they may be transferred again to whether to the animals and we eat those animals. Indirectly, we may be consuming them as well. Hormones and antibiotics as well. So those are some of the examples of these unintentional food additives, even though the manufacturers themselves, after they received the meat and they were to cook it, prepare somehow, and to put on the table of the consumer, they did not add them by themselves intentionally, but from the beginning it had been there, the meat already, without their knowing it still, so that's why it's called unintentional. And purposes for having those indirect additives will be to prolong shelf life, change or preserve the color of, for instance, the meat product that we are considering, so enhance the flavor, improve nutritional value, compensate for vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Here I mentioned those, the minimum requirement, the dose required, the recommended dose, daily dose, and so. In some cases, for some populations, certain regions, we may be having deficiencies of certain minerals or vitamins, so they may be needed to added to the food, or so that to compensate those deficiencies. Maintain freshness of the food as much as possible. For example, the food contact substances that I mentioned, the film used to wrap one tray containing steak or beef, for instance, we might want to have that certain material there with these properties so that it will maintain the beef or the meat as fresh as in a longer term storage as possible. Or prevent spoiling, again, prevent that certain food material to start deteriorating. And could be also to facilitate food processing also. So this part was also a little bit fast, but I wanted to finish earlier so that you may have some time to rest. And do you have any comments or questions for whether it is this final part or from the morning? Whichever content, it doesn't matter. If you have any word that you did not understand, or if you any concept which you did not understand as well, you may ask, please.
I have a question about multiple emulsions.
Yes.
So, for example, you said that when vitamin C is used in this multiple emulsion delivery method, the decomposition rate would be slower.
Yeah.
But how does it slow down the decomposition rate? Because it will still be in contact with light, and it is still somehow dissolved in water, even though it's small molecules of water inside the water.
Yeah, so this, in case of vitamin C, for instance, maybe not only by being exposed to light, but also in most cases we need oxygen to be present there, so it will start oxidizing, it will start degrading. So when we have these different layers, say it is dissolved in water, and we have this layer of oil and then water outside again, in order for the oxygen to penetrate in this outer aqueous phase and penetrate the oil, to cross through the oil to reach the inner aqueous phase, it is more difficult whether it was just in aqueous solution here exposed to air and it will already start degrading. So from the sense that the oxidation rate may be avoided or reduced once it is more difficult to get oxygen through the inner oil phase. Okay. Any other question or comment? No? What about from Taiwan? Do you have any comment? Could be contents explained during the morning or this last one? Any topic? Whether you did not understand anything or you understood everything or you're not interested. I don't know. Anyway, if you have any question, please go ahead. Are you all okay? And here also? Small danger. If not, we'll finish by now. And then next, we'll start from 2, right? Okay, so at least you may have some time to rest before Professor Kitamura will take over. So thank you very much. これは一番最後でいいんですね。ありがとうございます。最初。
next 1 o'clock